What if you could help others to find the power to heal themselves? Physically, emotionally, and spiritually.
When I started teaching my classes, it was in 2002, and I was just doing the past life regressions and contacting the subconscious part. But then as the time went on and we found how powerful this was and what we could do with it, a lot of the students began saying, you know, advanced past life regression doesn't really tell what it's all about. This is so much more than that. We think you should change the name. So it was a few years ago we decided to change the name to Quantum Healing Hypnosis Technique. And this is the healing technique that we've now been teaching it, well, since 2002, that's 12 years.
What if you could time travel with them? Visit mythical places or angelic realms, other worlds, other galaxies. Help others to speak to their higher selves. You can. Dolores has taught thousands of people from across the world how to use QHHT, and now you can learn her method by going directly to dolorescannon.com. And don't forget to mention the discount code MORETALKS.
Established over 100 years ago, Watkins Books is one of the world's oldest and leading independent bookshops specializing in esoterica. We have the widest selection of esoteric books in the UK, and our friendly and knowledgeable staff are here to assist you in a unique ambience of our shop. So come and visit us in the heart of London as we're open every day.
The comments and views expressed on The More Show are those of the people that make them and do not necessarily reflect the view of Kevin Moore, The More Show, or this radio station and its affiliate or sponsors. This show is for entertainment purposes only.
Broadcasting from the UK and across the world online. You're now watching the UK's only alternative late night talk show, and I'm your host, Kevin Moore. For the next hour, I'll be covering subjects that will open up your mind and provide you with information you may have never heard before. On today's show, I'm joined with Alan Greenfield, who is a long-time student of esoteric spirituality and a past elected member of the British Society for Psychical Research and the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena from the 1960s. Now, he has twice been the recipient of the UFOlogist of the Year award of the National UFO Conference. He is also a futurist with a remarkable track record of giving accurate predictions of future history. He is also a past president of the Atlanta Science Fiction Organization, which pioneered the prototype for science fiction conventions as they are now commonly across the US. Alan Greenfield, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I have a strange feeling of deja vu, and I'm glad to be with you.
That wouldn't be from earlier on, the system failing, would it? Yes, it could be, couldn't it?
It could conceivably be, but I tend towards the more occult explanation of things. It's kind of the part of the business. Whoops, I've given away a secret.
Well, this show it's going to be titled UFOs and the Occult. But we're not going to just stick on that subject, as we've spoke about off air as well. There's so much expansiveness in your work and with the way this conversation is going to go as well. I don't think you would want to stay just on that subject, would you, neither?
No, although I can say, let me give you what I think is true, and then we can sort of springboard from there.
Well, before you do, how about just give us a bit of background? Sorry about this. How about give us a bit of background on yourself? Because I don't know too much about you in the sense of how did you get interested in the paranormal, the ufology, and you know how did it start for you, and how long have you been involved for? Is it probably 50 plus years? Would you say?
50 plus years, definitely. I was interested even before that. I can recall when I was but a wee lad, my parents made an annual jaunt to Miami, and I can remember very vividly my father talking about the famous July 1952 UFO sightings over the Pentagon and the White House that caused such a great stir and eventually led to the CIA panel that concluded private UFO groups would be subverted by the Soviets. You know, that's 1950s think, McCarthy era and all that. Was something we had over here. It was a problem of some duration. I made the blacklist at 6, but that's okay. It's an honor, a badge of honor now. But the fact that that stuck in my mind tells you something. Then in 1960, I had what I took to be a minor UFO sighting. It happened coincidentally, or I would prefer synchronistically, about a month after I had read an article about NICAP, the National Association for Aerial Phenomena, whatever they call themselves. And they said, if you ever have a sighting, report it to us at 1536 Connecticut Avenue, Washington, D.C. Don't write them. They're not there anymore. I'm not even sure they're there anymore. And anyway, they know nothing. But be that as it may, knew nothing. Donald Kehoe and Richard Hall, both of whom have gone on to that great saucer in the sky. But in any case, I now think that it was 2 jets that I was seeing from the rear, or seeing their lights, and it was not remarkable, but at the time it was a game changer. That same year, 1960, I'm sure the Freudians would make something of this as well, as I was sort of pubescent during that period, not to, belabor the point. But I also joined the Mystic Arts Book Society. That was University Books, weird stuff outlet. Anything that wasn't nailed down under copyright, I got and read. And also started reading Fate magazine, which was devoted to the paranormal. And back in the day, it was popular version. It was a pulp magazine, one of the last, actually, that was a non-science fiction magazine. I think there's still a few of the science fiction ones and mystery ones out there somewhere at your local pharmacy or whatever. But nevertheless, all of those interests came at the same time. I didn't connect them at the time, but somewhere in the late 1960s, I reached a point, having done quite a bit of world traveling at that time, and travel broadens, I realized that there are certain bottom line common denominators betwixt all of these areas, the paranormal, UFOs, fairy lore, supposed mythological bestiaries that would now be called cryptozoology, and UFOs and UFO beings, that if you reduce them to those common denominators, you begin to think this may all be an aspect of the same thing. Given that I have now had a 40-year fight with the establishment in each of those fields, including the Grand Master of one of the great occult orders of antiquity, who basically told me, don't write UFO books or you'll never be promoted in our order. To which I said, yes, sir, and thought, I'll write what I please. But nevertheless, I was intimidated enough. There were 10 years between my secret cipher of the Ufonauts, which linked the grid page in Aleister Crowley's famous Liber Legis, the Book of the Law. Actually, I call it liberal, if you read the cover correctly. The the funny names, as I call them, that show up in UFO lore. And then I discovered in mediumship, same things. They had that kind of coordination if you used standard Kabbalistic coding. So I wrote Secret Cipher of the Ufonauts down in my little hometown in central Georgia, right next to the atomic energy plant where they make plutonium triggers. They used to, actually. They don't make them anymore, I think. And they dump their stuff in the river that we drank out of. So that explains why I have 3 heads. And why I keep slumping in my seat, because my spine turned to jelly some years ago. But I'm kidding, people, kidding. Not about the plutonium. That's no joke. But and there's no more there if any of our listeners are anxious to blow something up. There's nothing but unemployed scientists in that particular region. But in any case, I discovered that there was resistance on the part of the paranormal community saying UFOs are not respectable. Resistance on the part of the cryptozoologists, not as much, saying, well, UFOs are okay, but this occult stuff, that's, satanic and evil, and we don't want to get involved in that. And most surprisingly of all, the UFO community was pretty accepting of all that, provided I held on to the ETH, the extraterrestrial so-called hypothesis. It's actually more a thought, an idea, a concept. But I realized at some point, on the border of being an epiphany, why did we think in the first place that whatever these things are, they came from other planets? We didn't see them coming from other planets. We don't, generally speaking, see them on other planets. They're either close to the Earth or they're landed on the Earth, but they seem to be an Earth-based phenomena. Furthermore, as you get further into it, you discover that they go back at least as long as human beings have been able to scrawl something on walls. They're now saying that Neanderthals got the knack of scrawling things on walls. So I suppose as long as there have been human beings or some reasonable facsimile thereof, these things have been around and always on or near the Earth. So I decided that the extraterrestrial, quote, hypothesis, unquote, was a poor explanation based more on a belief system, and belief systems and science don't go well together. In fact, they corrupt any kind of scientific inquiry. If you have a pre-existing belief, you will find evidence of that, unless you're a very, very stern self-disciplinarian on such matters. And most people aren't. Most people aren't even aware that they're looking for evidence to support their pre-existing thoughts. So my greatest influences were, in the early days, were Carl Jung's A Modern Myth, or Flying Saucers, myth of a modern myth of things seen in the sky, I think it was called, and Leon Festinger's pioneering study of cognitive dissonance when prophecy fails, because I realized that people were, my conclusions might have been quite different from theirs, but I realized that in all of these cases, from ghosts, I no longer use the term apparitions because everybody seems to think that's the Virgin Mary or something in a piece of soap, and I don't think the Virgin Mary, should she happen to have existed or not, would manifest in a bar of soap and get scrubbed away, as it were. So I say ghost. It's a loose-knit term and has been plebeianized by the telly. It's all of these amateur ghost hunters. It's definitely been downhill from the SPR, which I was an elected member of for a while, but they long ago abandoned their orientation towards the stuff that most intrigues me. They've sort of become I get a notice for a meeting in London once a month, and I'm afraid I'm not able to attend. But the original group were some very, very serious people, and they did a lot of investigations of paranormal phenomena, including what we will colloquially refer to as ghosts. And same thing as UFOs. They appear and disappear. One person sees them, 3 people see them, one person doesn't. One person sees them, 3 people don't. If something appears...
Caught on camera as well?
Yes, caught on camera sometimes. Although I think the photographic evidence of any of these things is weaker than the case studies will allow. There are some photos that are good, but proportionately, the photos, interestingly enough, often are not up to the descriptions, from which I began to infer there's something dimensional going on here. There's a psychological element in this and a dimensional element. And I then fell under the influence of Edwin Abbott, whose Flatland basically said a 2-dimensional creature cannot actually see a 3-dimensional object. I guess his point had a lot to do with geometry, but it also had a lot to do with underlying philosophy, because he points out if there is a 3rd dimension, perhaps there is a 4th, 5th, and 6th. Along came, well, actually it came along before me, even back in the dinosaur days when I was born, the Copenhagen solution to the problem of quantum mechanics, and subsequently the many worlds interpretation, which, while not proven, has some interesting math behind it. And I thought perhaps all of these phenomena are our brains, which, after all, in biological times, we just dropped out of the trees and stood upright a moment ago. Never mind geological time, and certainly never mind cosmological time. So we've got senses that are adept at eating, reproducing, and not getting eaten, and not much else, really. So whatever else we've learned to do is very, very recent. And if we encountered something that was more complex than the 5 senses that we have, we would either not perceive it at all, or we would perceive it in some sort of contaminated way, that our mind would attempt to resolve it in some kind of terms that made some kind of sense to us. Someone who was space-minded might see a spaceship and little beings from out there. Someone who was interested in nature might see a Bigfoot-type creature or a Loch Ness monster or whatever. Someone who was oriented towards religion or spirituality more broadly, religion having apparently disappeared in your part of the world, we'll just say spirituality and let it go at that, might be inclined to see ghosts or spirits. Interestingly, where people have the most spirituality are the most cases of that sort, which would be Iceland at this point, sort of in between continents. So I think what we're dealing with is one phenomenon that we see in different ways according to our own psyches. There are other people involved in this work, that living and dead, that have reached this same conclusion, but I think not before me. I reached around 1967. I had just met Jacques Vallée. I don't think he was yet on that channel. And the rest of them are all dead. Gordon Crichton, I hear, has passed on just recently, and of normal causes. I believe he was elderly or somewhat near it, because I knew him from the 1960s on, and in the work of Flying Saucer Review, which was actually a uniquely in the world a responsible UFO magazine, along with Magonia and one or two others.
So I bet you got to meet some amazing people in your life that have now unfortunately not with us anymore, but you actually got the chance to be in their presence and see them at the conferences.
No. They were in my presence, but that's not important.
Well, let's just reverse it. They were in your presence, yeah.
My friend Jim Mosley, we talked a lot on the phone back in the day when long-distance phone calls. He was in New Jersey at that time, and I was right here. Jim was a well-to-do man, and my father was a well-to-do person, which doesn't explain why I live on the dole now, but that I suppose it's because I don't charge for anything that I do. Well, my books bring in a little royalties, but that's not enough to pay the bill and keep my son fed and blah, blah, blah. So Jim, somewhere in the 1966, he began to talk about this remarkable guy that he had met. And Jim was a non-enthusiast. Some people think he was a non-believer in any of this stuff, and probably, again, belief doesn't enter into it. But he always thought there was some signal within the noise of the UFO phenomena. He began to talk about John Keel. Well, every year in those days, I would go to New York, stay at the New York Hilton on a fairly high floor over Times Square, and watch all the people acting silly in the streets when the ball came down, marking the next year. And we usually had a 72-hour party that sort of people ran in and out. So that year, end of 66, beginning of 67, Mosley brought John Keel to our little gathering. It was far more sober than most gatherings of that sort. Well, I don't think I ever saw Jim Mosley draw a sober breath in his life, but he knew how to navigate, as all really hardcore wealthy drunks do. So he brought Keel, who more or less neither eats nor drinks. And Keel was as fascinating as advertised. And while he hadn't reached that point yet, I could see he's reaching in the direction. He's looking at the UFO phenomenon and adjacent things like the Men in Black and Mothman. Mothman became his touchstone. Right. But he's headed in that direction. He's willing to give all of this stuff a try. And my hunch is he's going to be on this channel. And when his book, which was much cut down from the original Operation Trojan Horse, came out, he was indeed on the same wavelength that I had already been talking about for years. Not because of me, I never mentioned it, but because I could see that he was headed that way. Yeah. And I knew Keel pretty well, knew him well enough to know that if I took him to lunch in a nice place, he didn't eat. He said, "I've never liked food." And there is a famous and living ufologist who once said to me and several other friends, and because he's a living ufologist and doesn't like me, I'm not going to mention his name, he said, and I'll try to do it the way he did, if ever there was anybody in ufology who was one of them, it's Keel. And I knew what he meant. Keel had an expressionless face, but his work was magnificent.
It was. And, I can't believe you got to meet him. That's what we got to be in his. You got to hear what this man had to say, and it was down the same line of thinking as well. Even back then, with yourself. I mean, that was what the Richard Gere movie was based on. The Mothman Prophecies was based on John's work, wasn't it?
Yes,
in a loose way.
The movie. And then I'm not going to knock the movie. I went to see it in the theater, which I rarely do. And I expected, of course, the usual, how do you say schlock in English? The usual sensationalized, cut to the aliens coming in. Yes. Well, to my surprise, it was very accurate in depicting the situation from Keel's point of view. So in a sense, they followed his account in the Mothman Prophecies, the book, pretty closely. Now, they didn't do the Gray Barker version. He was a good friend of mine who sort of got down in the weeds and was more a folklorist than a traditional ufologist. And he was from West Virginia and knew how to spin a tale and get the essence out of it without making it boring. But the movie, the only thing that is wrong is that they failed to realize that the strange phone calls were probably from Jim Moseley and Gray Barker having fun with Keel, because Keel was totally straight-laced, and when Moseley and Barker would get together, they would get stoned and drunk and play phone pranks like they were kids. And people have criticized them for that. I was even the recipient of one of those calls with beep, beep, beep sounds, and you will discontinue this project or reap the results during a citywide UFO skywatch, which showed me something about UFOs. But they were also serious in their own way. Okay. Keel, however, was serious on and off, and the movie reflects that. So when he was talking to an alien voice, he was talking to Jim and Gray, I'm pretty sure.
All right.
They're both gone now, so
of course,
I can
know.
tell that.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, okay, well, there's one fascinating guy that you got to meet, and I've interviewed someone about the Mothman prophecies many years ago, but just to have someone like yourself now who actually met John, that's really special. Now, there's a spiritual side to you as well, obviously. And you were involved with readings, tarot readings, or there was some involvement that you had with that. Just tell us about that, and also, do you think that having that side open to you allowed you to look at this whole UFO phenomena from a different perspective? Do you think if you never had that side of you, then you would not be looking at the phenomena as you do now?
I would like to think that I would have eventually realized that the ETH went nowhere and asked myself the musical question, what's wrong with this? Something that most ufologists don't do. They're still on that same page, but probably so. And probably because I was predisposed towards spirituality, the paranormal, the mystical, as well as the scientific and the study of UFOs, cryptozoological phenomena, that is to say, strange beasts that appear and disappear. And therefore, I was predisposed to see linkages if there were any. The thing is, I wasn't looking for that. I have no axe to grind on that, but once I realized it and began to look for ways to define that, if any, coinciding effect, that I found there was plenty of evidence for it, and that ufologists and perhaps the paranormal researchers were looking in the wrong direction.
That's interesting what you just said there. I think even nowadays, the frustration I've got, I love the direction you're coming from, right? Because you really are looking at this whole paradigm, this whole phenomena with a completely different filter. But there's still a lot of nuts and bolts ufologists, and I would never. I'm never going to say, oh, they're wrong, or I can't align with them with what they do. They're doing the best they can do, and they're sticking with what's safe for them in a sense of what they've always known. But it is frustrating sometimes, isn't it, where you see this bigger picture, yet they would never want to even be in alignment with that picture.
I wish I could say something nice about those people, but it seems like they're in a safe foxhole, as it were, and are afraid to move out of it. I will say this, and it's an interesting observation on something or other, but in 1963, Rick Hilberg and the late Dale Redegg and the late Alan Manick, that's scary, and myself came up with the idea of having a non-contactee annual UFO convention that wasn't held at Giant Rock and didn't have a rejuvenation machine or any of those trappings, but nevertheless took a fair and open view of things. In fact, some of the contactees showed up. And that was the longest running UFO convention ever. So skipping far ahead, last year we decided to have a reunion of those who were survived. David Halpern, who is a brilliant ufologist now and gets ignored a lot because he's a scholar, and scholars get ignored in ufology. And there was Rick Hilberg and some of the people who are in the new MUFON. MUFON used to not touch anything weird, but including me, I might add, when I went to their conventions, I felt like I was the alien amongst the humans, or perhaps I was the human amongst the aliens, as the case may be. But apparently they have broadened their scope, or the old generation has died off and a new generation has come along. But the interesting thing is, the people that showed up who were survivors of that long period of 50 years are all on the same page that I'm on now. I don't know whether any of that was my influence. It might not have been. It might have been just them reaching their own conclusions. But they basically were on the what Jim Moseley called the 4.5D theory, which is probably doesn't do it justice in some form or other. Oh yeah, Tim Beckley was there. He would kill me if I didn't mention the ever-present, omnipresent, omnipublishing Mr. UFO, Timothy Green Beckley, a friend. I call him my oldest friend, which is a double entendre if I ever heard one.
Okay, so
but they're all on that page. I mean, if you read Beckley's books that he publishes, you would think that he's on the Van Tassel sensational page, but he publishes books. It doesn't necessarily mean his own conclusions. His own conclusions are very, very close to mine, as he has indicated to me.
Yes. Okay, well, that's an interesting answer. It definitely is. And just before we carry on as well, obviously, at the beginning of this interview, you were going to just very briefly just touch on the connection with the occult and with ufology. I think we've kind of covered it in one sense, right? But just for those who are really interested in that as well, what is the exact connection with the occult and with ufology? Is it what you've spoken about before, or is there even a more expansive answer than what we've talked about?
There's a more expansive answer. The thing is, it will meet with skepticism with anybody who has a nut or bolt left in the game, but it can be experimentally demonstrated. I will say that my provisional current hypothesis is that all of these phenomena have to do with the validity of in-brain theory. That is, that there are other dimensions of reality that occasionally more or less touch our own reality, but that even their laws of physics are different. What the occult is all about is exploring that other reality and perhaps even interpenetrating it through what is considered magical ritual, what I consider to be a technology, perhaps handed on to us from otherness somewhere far back in history, and of course with time has been corrupted, as many people involved in such have received ye old Bernie at the stake. Nobody expects the Spanish, English, Dutch, any other Inquisition, but nevertheless, it has survived. It has survived in little corners of, and they will hate me for this, Freemasonry, only the more esoteric schools, of which I have a considerable knowledge of through my previous 20-year membership in how shall we put it, one of the great orders of antiquity as they describe themselves. Too authoritarian for my taste, but just about everything is too authoritarian for my taste. Anybody who can tell me what to do is an authoritarian. So
I feel you there. I feel you.
Except my parents, God rest their souls. They don't, they don't count because that's their job, was their job, and they did it with tolerance beyond understanding.
Don't all parents, hey? Don't all parents.
This is tea. It would be coffee, but in honor of doing a program in the UK, if there's still a UK, I'm drinking tea.
We love you for that. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, and where was I before I
the occult
went off
and
on a
the
tangent?
UFOs and the occult, and actually, there is actually something much bigger connected with it. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. The best thing that I can mention is that the strange names that show up in UFO lore, from contactee lore, from close encounter lore, from abduction lore, are names like, a good example is Ashtar. Ashtar actually is the masculine name of an ancient Sumerian, Babylonian, Assyrian deity, the feminine version of which is Ashtaroth or Ashtaroth, depending on whether you were a Sumerian or an Akkadian, but and much frowned on in the Hebrew scriptures. Worshipping in every leafy tree the Asherahs, which is just a variant of that. But in any case, Ashtar and Ashtar command show up in UFO lore. Ashtar is a demonic, I don't recommend demonic invocations, but standard magical invocation in the occult world includes this bestiary of angels and demons, which one can, under the proper circumstances and using the proper magical technology, one can invoke, and if one knows what one is doing, one can also banish at the end of it. I tell my students, you must have a consummate knowledge of banishing before you do anything in the way of invoking, because there are things that have been invoked that have never gone away because nobody bothered to banish them properly, or, if necessary, exorcise them. I have been involved in all of that. I've also done it with groups of people who have no knowledge of it, and they come up with the same material, even though they have absolutely no knowledge of it, have done the same thing that the most conscientious people who do seance type work have done, which I basically just did the invocation. And I had the Tyler of my lodge in front of one locked door, and I was in front of the other throughout the session, and yet they came up with the same material, which I didn't ask them about until after the experience was over. Even my eldest son, who is as skeptical as they can get, actually was involved in one of these translations to another dimension. And he believes none of this. So if you believe none of it, if I got Richard Dawkins to say, yeah, I met Ashtar, but he probably has a rational explanation, I'd go, aha, gotcha. But then he put on the God helmet and said, I don't feel anything. So, I don't know how much self-censorship we do. I do know that, objectively speaking, if you take a random group of people who have no particular axe to grind and don't know a great deal about this, and they come up with the same names, the same words, the same structure, that if you can, as I discuss in my 2 UFO books, Secret Cipher of the Ufonauts and Secret Rituals of the Men in Black, which, by the way, now for the first time in many years, I understand, and just found out yesterday, is out in a combined edition with a new introduction. I haven't seen it, so I can't really say that I endorse it, but the the people who are involved in it, I knew that they were going to do this, and I just found out yesterday. You usually find these things out when the publisher sends you a pile to send to your friends, but I said, send me a pile of these books so I can send them to my friends, but I'll have to read it first to see how it turns out. But the point of the whole book is, or both books, is that you can decode some of these weird names and be able to predict future events simply calculated from decoding it using classical Kabbalistic methods that come from the late Jim Lees, who discovered a cipher in Liber Alba Legis, the Book of the Law. Either Crowley wrote it or his buddy Iwas wrote it, depending on how you look at it. And I personally think Crowley wrote it, but there's a strange page in it with a grid on it, and Lees and his close associates came up with a cipher which works with these names and creates a kind of parallel. That is, it talks about the event that this word or name was generated out. Planetary name of a non-existent planet. Name of a being, non-existent being. Indrid Cold is a good example. Ashtar is another one.
Indrid Cold. Now that was used on the Mothman, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
And notwithstanding Jim Mosley's phone calls in the name of Indrid Cold, Indrid Cold, it's a good one.
But wasn't it on the phone call that he got the phone call to say that the bridge was going to collapse?
It was a different phone call on a different phone that probably neither Mosley nor Barker had the number of. And yes, and of course there was no way of knowing that. And I can assure you, neither Jim Mosley nor Gray Barker were in any way psychic.
No, so
that had to be from Indrid Cold.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying is when he got that, as we talked about this, the Mothman, just 10 minutes ago, but I'm just going back to that, when you said that, those phone calls were probably made by those guys, but in one of those phone calls, it was told that the bridge was going to collapse and, so many people would die, and that was true. That really happened. So it couldn't have been those guys that made that phone call predicting that. So who was it that made that phone call to John in the hotel room to tell him that the bridge was going to collapse?
Whatever Indrid Cold is, it was Indrid Cold, just the same being that appeared as a sort of man to a witness who was stopped on the highway, whose window he approached, and who said some very interesting things, including, "Don't be afraid, I come from a planet that is much weaker than your own." I believe that this was an interdimensional being who had sort of escaped here. Not the first and not the last.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
Perhaps because he didn't like it at home. That's how America happened. People that didn't like it and
come to
in
America.
England or Holland came to America to start their. They didn't like the Church of England, so they came over here and started their own monopoly churches. And
yeah,
that's where the states came from. They couldn't stand each other.
But
they still can.
Okay, yeah, true. That's very interesting what you've got to say there. I know I stopped you in the mid-flow there. It was just something that came to me. I was like, I've got to ask you that because I know I'll forget, and I know, off air I'll be like, I wish I'd asked him that. So, right. So the Mothman was probably an interdimensional creature. That's what the line of thought is here right now. That would make a lot of sense, actually.
The whole phenomena, plural, that took place in West Virginia in the period roughly from 1966 to 1970, but which I understand from local people is still going on. I don't have Gray anymore to document them, but that was the peak period. It was like a trip to Neverland. We had Men in Black cases, including during our UFO convention that year that happened to be in Charleston, West Virginia. And I got my one and only photo of a man in black because I was young and brave and stupid. But I did manage to do that because he followed us around for a long time. he looked like he was 17 or so and called himself a man in black in training, but he showed up 10 years later with the same age, same appearance to other people. So it's a very weird story in and of itself, and if there weren't umpteen witnesses to it, I would be disinclined to even mention it. I didn't for many years, and I didn't publish the photo until about 2 years ago on my Facebook blog, I think was where I put it up. But now it's one of those things that if you Google Men in Black images, there it is, along with the only other authentic photo. And there were bestiary phenomena, the Mothman, variously described, and there were lots and lots and lots of UFO sightings, and there was a prediction. So that comes out of the paranormal world of a disaster. It was like, for a moment, the worlds had come together, and many, many ordinary people were seeing things that were not of this world. And then it ceased to be. Maybe because of the disaster. I don't know. Maybe to wax spiritual, perhaps the souls of those who were terrified as they died on the Silver Bridge, or whatever. Time is a funny thing there. It precedes it in time, and it goes on after that time as we count time. But maybe the terror of that experience produced the circumstances in which these worlds could interpenetrate. I don't know.
It's possible,
but that's an interesting.
It's possible. It is. Thank you for that thought. Thank you for all the information you're talking about today. And I know I sort of interrupted you, but just going back to the occult aspect of this as well. Then, when you talked about futurist predictions, then that sort of ties in with the Mothman, doesn't it? Quite well. Has there been other cases? Would you say many other cases where the occult's tied in with ufology?
Absolutely. There's even been another one which was underplayed by everyone but me. I don't recall the date offhand, and I when I do a television or radio or podcast or any of that stuff, I like not to have any notes present so that I can be reasonably spontaneous. And a few years ago, a bridge on an interstate highway, and those are tough, although now dated bridges, collapsed, I believe, in either Minneapolis or St. Paul. They're twin cities in Minnesota. When I looked at the number of the highway, I did the little computation that I recommend in the books, and it said you will find it present there. So I looked around for UFO cases in that vicinity at the time of the incident, or within 24 hours before or after. That's sort of an arbitrary rule. Instead, I found a Mothman case. Mothman appears, and the bridge collapses. So Mothman and bridges, I don't know. I mean, it probably happens more often than comes to my attention, but there are cases of that type all the time. The thing is, nobody tries to correlate it to anything else. They say, oh, how tragic, a bridge collapsed and people were killed. We need to build up the infrastructure in this country and make America great again. Editorial comment.
Where have you got that saying from? Who says that?
It came to me from an alien who needs to go back to his home planet.
Right, that makes sense.
No names mentioned, Trump, but be that as it may. If he's elected, I'm gone. I need to get out.
Well, I think a lot of people might feel the same, actually. Yeah. Well,
Canada is already making the passport.
Well, they're making the wall, aren't they? Canada's building a wall.
Yeah, the Canadians. That is rumored. I wouldn't be surprised. And there's a certain justice there. Karma is real. What goes around comes around.
It seems to be the case, doesn't it? But you got it. I say this in other interviews. is you got to give Trump one card, is that he is bringing the racistness in America to the spotlight. He has exposed, that side of America, which I think needed to just come out a bit still. I don't want to think that there's racism in America. Christ, you know what I mean? But obviously there is still issues, and there's some healing to do, and there's a lot of change going on in the world right now.
I was born into and grew up in the segregated Deep South, and I assure you, from personal knowledge and experience, being kind of an outsider, because while native-born parents, I'm Jewish, and my parents are Jewish, and we lived in a tight-knit community. I was 6 before I knew there were anything other than black people and Jews. I was astonished that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants were all over the place. I walked into the school, and there were all of these other people, but so it was a shock. But it was worse than apartheid in South Africa. Much, much worse. It was much more violent. And if you think all that is gone, you're wrong. It's no longer the legal law. It was the law of this state and many other southern states, despite who won the Civil War. There are people out here in the suburbs that still drive around with Confederate battle flags on their cars, and incongruously an American flag on the other. Actually, I don't think it started with Trump. It started with Obama being elected, and it brought it out. It's been more or less like polite anti-Semitism against black people. It's there, but you don't talk about it openly. But then the birther movement started, and the birther movement was pumped by one Donald J. Trump. He was the prime mover behind it, and it went on for the entirety of Obama's first term, because he's not like us. Well, what us is he talking about? Clearly, it's the black-white divide in America. It's still very great, except for a handful of people,
Yeah, of course. Doesn't this, but aren't we going through a spiritual evolution still? We're spiritually growing now. Now, you would think that whatever's visiting us, whatever this phenomena is, it may be a little bit more spiritually evolved than us. What if this phenomena that we call, that we've been talking about all this time, this UFO phenomena that, as our conversations carried on, in the sense that it's not the phenomena that we thought it was, it's not nuts and bolts, it's something greater than that, it's a greater framework than that. What if this was here to help us to spiritually grow? What if whoever's visiting us, whatever these multi-species are that are coming here, some for different purposes, but in a greater, grander scheme of thing, it's here to help us spiritually evolve? Have you considered that?
Oh, absolutely, because it was the first theory that came out even before I was born. Meade Lane, who was both interested in UFOs, interested in trans-channel communication, and was an initiate of the occult, started Borderland Science Research Associates, or now called Borderland Science Research Foundation, in 1945. And with his book, The Coming of the Guardians, he postulated that these were other dimensional beings who communicated with us in order to be our guardians in both senses of the term. That is, our guardians in the sense of protecting us, and our guardians in the sense of our nannies to move us forward spiritually. If you look at a lot of UFO type incidents, they have a close resemblance to near-death experiences. And what happens after a near-death experience occurs? Generally speaking, the percipient, term I learned from the late John Keel, the percipient becomes a much better person. So does that happen with UFOs? I don't know, because I don't have the facilities to track that. But if these nuts and bolts people would get off of their nuts and bolts, and no double entendre there, and take a look at the relationship to other phenomena, I think that they would find that the daily occurrence of these cases results in spiritual change for the people involved.
Now you look at the Travis Walton case. There's a guy now that will say if he was on this show that it was a very positive, enlightening experience. This is now what he's saying about it. It was positive, it was enlightening, they saved his life. That's what he's saying about this experience. And others as well, who have had abductions, when they go under regression, now I know you don't always think regression's the greatest tool, but just let me say this, when they've gone under regression and then they've connected to what really happened potentially in that scenario, it was much more loving, much more positive. Positive in the sense that these beings that abducted them were future aspects of them. They were the same soul lineage. These beings that abducted them had less of a veil than what we do, and they're able to remember their past life connections, and actually they connect with their past life selves in a sense to heal themselves to progress further. That's just one thinking out there. There's other reasons that those abductions happen. It's not just this, but there is some sort of soul connection. Have you heard of that at all?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I have seen it happen in abductees and contactees that I've talked to. John Reeves, the Brooksville, Florida man who I visited many times, his experience started with a little alien who, he said, flashed a picture of him, but what he saw was a bright light, and thereafter he was a very different kind of human being. Charles Hickson, who was a shipyard worker in Mississippi back in the days we were just talking about in the Deep South. By the time I met him, he was a gentle, kind, decent human being. Was it because of his experience? I can't say for certain, but it is highly suggestive. Ralph Lale, a one-time moonshiner, according to local sources, and the head of the Outer Space Rock Shop Museum, who I visited a couple of times, was by the time I met him, very, very decent guy with a shady past, which he had an experience that resembles the sort of Tannhauser type experience of going into a fairy hill and then off to other worlds. The specifics I take with a grain of salt, but the exaltation is the same as in near-death experiences. And some of the phenomena, tunnel, light, feeling of oneness with the universe. We are all one is a term that was generated out of Mount Shasta UFO circles.
Here's another thing as well. Thank you for that. I'm sorry to butt in. I hate butting in, but I know our time's limited. When Jane Roberts was channeling Seth, there was a session that took place where someone got to see Seth that was an artist. And when they artistically drew Seth, it was a grey being.
What a surprise. Oh, I did want to say one thing about what you said about hypnotic regression. You've obviously seen somewhere where I said I don't count reincarnation cases that are through hypnotic regression. It's not that they might not be true. It's that documenting them is far more difficult than a child who remembers a previous life and has been investigated by scientists.
Jim Tucker, for example.
Jim Tucker is the current, successor to Dr. Stevenson, and I have read all of the case reports that they've published, and they are amazing, but they don't involve hypnosis whatsoever.
No, based on as well.
That doesn't mean that if they had hypnotized the subject, they wouldn't have gotten the same report. It's just that the subjective mind can do tricks.
Absolutely. And Tucker's work actually is based on the principles, believe it or not, of Edgar Cayce. He's a massive follower of Cayce's work, Jim is.
It's not a surprise.
No.
I think Cayce spent half his time in another dimension.
Definitely. Now, see, I always say to people on this show, I think the framework of the reality that where we go to has never been written about and has never been documented, because even though there's many books on the understanding of people's truths of that reality as they've glimpsed it, I think the true nature of that framework is beyond our current understanding, beyond our conceptualization. So no book really says it how it is. Maybe that's because potentially when you cross over, you create truth, and the truth is whatever you want it to be in that reality. It's that malleable that reality is. And I think when most people, even under hypnosis or that's had a near-death experience or whatever it may be, can't find the words to describe that reality. So when we say, we go through a tunnel, there's a life review, and a blah, 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 well, yes, as truth as far as brain can understand it, because you're still in the physical form, but really when you do cross over, the reality is something even greater than anything that you could even have imagined or have ever been told. Now, is that the reality, the true reality, and this is a false reality? Or are they one of the same? What is the UFO nature then? Is the UFO nature a complete mix of future beings coming back here to visit, other beings coming back here for holidays, other interdimensional beings coming here as well, many interdimensional beings? Are angels part of that interdimensionalness? Because angels is just a word for something that people get to experience that they call angels, but it's not really that. It's something else. It's probably connected to the UFO field or this other field. I think you know what I'm trying to say. It's difficult to put it in words, but is there a whole mishmash, or is it really just all from these other dimensions? And when we say other dimensions, I'm talking about infinitive dimensions, not just like 1 to 10.
Well, yeah, there is a version of in-brain theory that there are a specific number of dimensions. They may have very different physical principles involved inside those dimensions, but if they touch us, of course, to some extent, they become subject to the laws of physics as we understand them. Then there is another view. I tend to hold with it. There's also good math in support of it, that there are an infinite number of dimensions. And it's people who are so inclined, it's a way of getting away from the idea of deity, but you just keep pushing it back into one dimension after another. Eventually you have to say there is an omnidimensional truth of which we are a tiny fragment.
Yes.
And of which our minds, which also are subject to quantum entanglement and quantum processes, are but a fraction of a fraction. Nevertheless, we are the entirety. That's not something that is logical, but logic fails. That's why we use advanced math to deal with these things, because that's as close as we're going to get. And most of the scientists who have delved into this say ultimately we probably will never fully understand this, not as long as our minds are encased in the meat of our brain.
Right. So true. And I'm with you on there. I dig maths. I dig science. Right. I think it plays an important part. Of course it does. Right. Science and spirituality together, not separate. Right. I would say
there's probably no real science without spirituality,
yes,
and probably no real spirituality without science.
Exactly. Even though a lot of the great scientists right now do separate them. And I like what you said about infinite dimensions. I would say there probably is infinite dimensions. I would say those dimensions on higher levels just channeling to lower dimensions. I would say just to learn from, to gain from. I would say the reality of those dimensions are just as real as this, or realer, if there is something realer. I mean, there is 4K now. Imagine what 8K looks like. So it could be, right, 16K or more. So yes, these answers. There are no answers to this. I think what this conversation is going to is individual truth, and I think what a beautiful thing you do is you shine light to say you are allowed this truth. Look at what truth I've gained. You could have a truth as well. You don't need to limit yourself. Come up with your own truth. There's no definitive truth in this. That's what we're saying here, because we're never going to know until we've crossed over entirely. But I think one thing it does do is, I think what we talk about and these other levels, bringing that knowledge into present day moment is what's so important, because if we cross over to these other dimensions and we probably want, maybe we come back to this life again and again, maybe we can relive this life. That's never been talked about, has it? The reliving the same life again to get it right, maybe. Who knows? Not just past and future lives, but, the life now. I think it's all saying as well how important it was for us as a soul to come here as well.
Well, I think that's the school notion of development, that there's a good deal of evidence, mostly from the people that you mentioned, from Tucker and from Ian Stevenson, God rest his soul, and others, that indicate that, in fact, this is a somewhat tough learning experience. I don't think it's the bottom of the barrel, but I don't think that it's anywhere near the top either. So we need to have a certain something that neither science nor spirituality generally has, a certain humility before the universe. It seems to me that Einstein stated that very well. He basically said that if you don't have a certain awe of existence, you miss something that in the facts don't really correlate. And I think that's true. I think it was Niels Bohr who said, if you understand anything about quantum mechanics and aren't very, very disturbed, I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember the exact quote, there's something wrong with you. He probably wasn't as brutal about it.
Yeah. No, I understand what you're saying. I do. It's really difficult to end this conversation with you, because it's kind of difficult to know how to summarize all this, isn't it? Well, definitely, in a sense of the occult, then it does go hand in hand with the ufology, and it's really, I suppose, what we're saying between each other in this moment is that there is something connected with all these phenomena that has a centralized point in it, from the sense that it's all coming from the same space. It's all coming from. It's almost like the word is consciousness, that it all is. Is that the space it's all coming from? I'm struggling right now to put this into words, what we're talking about. It's so grand.
Our language is like our brains. It's limited to those things that we ordinarily experience, and becomes a very difficult way to convey the sort of thing that we're talking about. I try not to give ultimate solutions, but to suggest alternative approaches in order to find that personal truth that you alluded to earlier. And that's really all that we can do. I mean, I can do experimental work where I send people sort of like astronauts into the ether otherwhere, but their bodies stay here. And they're still tied to that. And just as you pointed out with near-death experiences, they're not post-mortem experiences. They're not after cellular death, or we wouldn't be hearing from them. So we can't really judge fully, but we can gain considerable knowledge and a better handle on reality.
Do you think if the phenomena, the UFO phenomena, comes from the side of the spirit world, in a sense, that they are here having an experience to better ourselves and to better themselves, that by coming here, they're not only gaining for themselves, but they're also trying to evolve us, which evolves them?
That's a good question. I think 90% of the intrusions into our reality, from fairy lore, which is a worldwide phenomenon, not confined to Ireland, as most people seem to think, all the way to Mothman, let's say, are accidental intrusions. The quantum physicists, by the way, the scientists who say they're not connected are not physicists. Generally speaking, physicists are way ahead of the biologists. Why? When biology catches on to quantum reality, we're going to see a quantum leap. no pun intended. Pun intended. I'm lying there. But 10%, I think, are exactly what you're saying. They're expeditions to teach something, if only to encourage what Heinlein called the sense of wonder.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much for that. How can people support Alan Greenfield? How can people help? Is there anything that people can do, I mean, to support you, to help you? I mean, your books have been coming up on the screen. Obviously, you'd recommend buying those. But is there anything else people can do?
Well, the only ones that I get any royalties on are the Complete Rite of Memphis Revised Edition, which I recommend to anybody who has proclivities in the direction of, the Golden Dawn, the OTO, Freemasonry, any of that. It's a must read, and it's been very favorably reviewed. If you want anything to do with my work, instead of giving a URL or a phone number, God help me, or anything like that. I've been on the internet since before it was the internet. So if you simply Google or otherwise do a search engine on Allen, A-L-L-E-N, that was my parents' little joke, Greenfield, like the song, once there were green fields, now there are none. Well, actually, there are quite a few. Me and my children and my cousins and cousins of cousins. If you Google my name, is that term used on your side of the pond?
It is. No, it is. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you will find thousands of places you can go and see and or hear my stuff. And if you do buy my books, I'm more than grateful, even if I don't get royalties on them.
Well,
my primary purpose is to get ideas out there.
Absolutely, and you definitely do that. I think you're way ahead of your time. You're way ahead of your time. You are. You really are.
That has its pluses and minuses, you know. You probably, I know that what I'm saying will probably come to be the standard understanding, but probably not in my lifetime. At least not this one.
Well, you never know. Never say never. Never say never. Never say never.
I'm still plugging away.
There you go. Exactly. Well, look, it's been so beautiful to have you on, Alan. I've really enjoyed your energy and just your vastness of really a little bit of a grasp on this. And I don't take anything away when I say a little bit. I just say that in the sense that it's just beyond vastness, this subject, and you handle it in such a great way, and you've really even helped me to see it from a different light. So thank you so much for that.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Heal and grow strong.
Well, we've come to an end on tonight's show. Don't forget that you can listen and watch all our past interviews on the More Show's official YouTube channel. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel for new daily shows. You may also find out more on all past and upcoming guests by going to themoreshow.com, and do like us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest updates. So until next time, be safe.